All right, let's go ahead and continue the discussion about framing and supporting your argument. So we've already gone through kairos and ethos, and I just moved it all over to one board so that I can use the other one. So now we need to go through and also talk about the other two. Well, we only do four in this class, so the other two rhetorical appeals, which is pathos and logos. Now, for pathos, what we're going to actually end up discussing here is emotions. Right? I'm really fond of one word definitions of all of these rhetorical appeals. So when you think of pathos, think of emotions. Now, pathos gets a bad rap a lot of times because people look at it and people look at rhetoric and everything as somehow manipulating. Or persuading. And I don't want you to think of pathos as that because it's really not, right? The ability to actually manipulate somebody's emotions takes a lot more than one singular piece of writing, right? Emotions about a topic and action, well, especially that actually lead to some sort of action take more than one piece of writing. But what we do want to do is still appeal to people's emotions and actually what we're going to call build an emotional common ground, right? So, how do we build emotional common ground? Right? That's the question. And the reason why we want to do this is because we feel definitely a particular way about a topic. And when you're writing any sort of argumentative paper or any sort of persuasive or anything like that, you want to, one, let your audience know how you feel about the topic and your passion for it, your indignation at something that happened, um, your sadness that it caused, any number of these things. And especially if it's as important as a narrative argument where you're putting a piece of yourself out there, you want your emotion, you want that moment and that experience to be momentous to your audience because it was momentous to you. You got something out of it. And if you're sharing this, you want to be able to have your audience have that same emotional common ground. So that's why we try to build it, to have the audience feel how you felt at that experience or at that moment. So how do you do that? Back to the book. There's a few ways actually. So one, we have to actually decide what emotion that is, which means a whole lot that you consider your readers and you consider your experience at that time. So which emotion do we want to kind of evoke in that exact moment? Now, you can have different emotions throughout your paper. You can start with one, you can lead into another, and you can end with another one. But we need to be able to recognize when those switches happen and what happened in our experience and in that narrative to switch that emotion and to make it switch. Next, we use examples or illustrations. So illustrations have a U? It does. Illustrations. Okay. So this, of course, in this paper is going to come from your narrative, from those examples, illustrations of the experience that actually happened to you. But when you do research or whatever, this comes from research, right? This comes from a not necessarily your lived experience, but a testimonial or an illustration of a, for instance, let us consider whatever experience. That'll come there. The next thing that we need to make sure that we are very aware of is tone. The tone of our writing affects the emotion a lot. So we need to make sure that we don't use overly flowery language. We need to make sure that it's not coercive in any sense. It needs to be direct. It needs to be clear. It needs to be concise. And it needs to make sure that we don't alienate other readers, right? Your audience, once again, is very diverse. A lot of different experiences, backgrounds, demographics, psychographics, all of these things. So we need to make sure that we are direct, concise, clear, and not alienating. Right? We don't want somebody to feel like they're not a part of our audience simply because of a word choice that we have there. Okay. So which emotion? How does it change? How do I make sure that I write about it in a way that my audience can connect to it and still feel whatever? Now, one last thing about maybe tone, but more word choice, right? Or let's actually write it down as style, right? There's a number of kind of writing ways that we can go through and add this kind of emotional thing. One is, of course, the word choice, right? We're all aware that certain words hold an emotional impact much more than other words do. We can also go through and use dialogue or direct quotes if it's research. That ends up being very powerful, especially depending on whose quotes, whose words you're going through and using. And the other one is actually to use lists. I suggest to a lot of people like using lists in their writing because it is a lot more impactful. There's an emotional weight to reading a list, depending on what's in the list, right? It's either really boring or it's almost exhausting. And it compiles and compiles and compiles and it keeps going and it keeps going. And you're just like, oh, wow, that was a lot, right? And there's an emotional, actual physical response that we as readers end up getting from that. So let us move on to logos really quick before we run really late. So logos, once again, we're just one word definition. Reasoning, right? We can also do logic, right? People like it when the word starts with the same letter, right? So logos, we can use logic or just reasoning. So we in this paper are using inductive, which I don't know if you need to be able to define necessarily, but we are taking a specific moment, right? Your experience, your narrative, and we're going to generalize it out to a larger audience. So we're going from you to Mason audiences. This ends up being inductive. Later on, when you actually do your research paper, you'll do deductive where it switches, where you go from a general big topic and you come down to like one little call for action. And you're like, go and do this and not necessarily fix the big, huge thing, but help the big, huge thing by doing this specific. That'll come later. Right now, we have this specific, and this is what it means for this larger population. That's what we're doing. So how do you logically pull something really specific into a really more general audience and a more general argument for that audience? Now, Largely, it comes down to evidence, right? If we're talking logic, we're talking evidence. So we will go through and make sure that we state the evidence, which we're going to make sure that we use credible evidence. And then we're going to provide analysis of that evidence, which is to say, as your book states, right, make sure that your conclusion follows the premise, right? But really, we're just gonna, where'd my eraser go? Provide analysis which explains how the evidence supports our claim. That's what analysis is. So really, we just have 3 steps when we go through and do logos, right? So the state the evidence, we're going to state it, we're going to cite it, we're going to quote it, we're going to make sure that people know that this is our experience, this is our narrative, and this is how we're using it as evidence for our thesis, right? Then we're going to make sure it's credible evidence. And credible evidence when we're doing research would be that we make sure that it's, reliable and current and accurate and relevant and all of those things for research. But for us, it's going back to ethos, right? It's credible evidence because we are a credible author and we have this credible experience, which is based in good judgment, which is knowledgeable and which addresses a complex issue and acknowledges the complex issue. So we have credible evidence because we are credible. And then we're going to provide analysis, which explains how this piece of evidence supports this overall claim. All right, so this, I'm not even sure I can back you up far enough without pushing you off my desk, but there. This is how we are going to go through and frame and support our narrative argument.